Well, thank you very much indeed for coming this evening, everybody, on a nasty, wet winter's night. We've got here two fantastic speakers to address the question of the future of Europe and Ukraine's role in it. Timothy Garton Ash is Professor of European Studies at Oxford. He's a regular columnist for The Guardian and has published 10 books. What makes him incredibly readable is the way he combines the analytical with the personal. I read his The File when it came out in the 90s and was absolutely gripped by it. He had lived in East Berlin as a student, and when the wall came down and the East German archives opened, he looked up his own Stasi file and discovered that almost all his East German contacts, perhaps I exaggerate slightly, but many anyway, had informed on him, sort of including sort of fellow students, landlady, and so on. And he then sought them out and confronted them. And their reactions provide this extraordinarily interesting window into how the East German system worked and the mental contortions involved, the people who lived there. All horribly relevant now, of course, to Russia. And this same sort of hard-headed but humane curiosity powers his latest book, Homelands, A Personal History of Europe, which came out just a couple of months ago. Again, it's a mixture of memoir and analysis, and it covers his own whole adult lifetime from the 1970s on. And my jaw dropped at the people he has interviewed or advised over the years. The list includes George W. Bush, Maggie, Blair, Helmut Kohl, Gorbachev, Pope John Paul II, Lech Walesa, Václav Havel, not to mention Erich Honecker and Oswald Mosley.
I'm not sure if I advise.
Interviewed or advised. But as well as rubbing shoulders with the great, he's also there on the ground. He's at the 1980 Gdansk shipyard strike that turned into the Solidarity movement. He's there in Kosovo in the middle of the Yugoslav wars. He's on the Maidan during the Orange Revolution. And so for all of us who are thinking, worrying about where Europe's headed and Ukraine's place within it, we have here the most experienced and expert of guides. So Professor Olga Onuch is Professor of Comparative and Ukrainian Politics at the Manchester University. She's held research posts in Harvard and at the University of Toronto, and her PhD, which she did at Oxford, compared pro-democracy movements in Ukraine and Argentina. She's since been the UK leader of a multinational research project looking into protest movements worldwide, and in particular into how individuals make the choice between protesting or emigrating. And like Tim's, her writing combines analysis with the personal. Her new book, The Zelensky Effect, written with George Washington University's Henry Hale, opens with Zelensky's fateful decision, when Russia invaded again last year, to stay in Kiev rather than to evacuate the government to Lviv or to Poland, as most expected he would do. And it then backtracks to the 90s, interleaving a fascinating account of Zelensky's life and career with that of post-independence Ukraine. And the book's impeccably data-driven. And an appendix at the back is packed with often surprising charts and graphs, but it's also very heartfelt. And a lovely and unusual feature is the song recommendations that Olga gives us at the end of each chapter. So I looked them all up on Spotify, and I very much enjoyed them. Highly recommended. It's quite a gloomy moment now for Ukraine overall. The war may be at a stalemate. Western support may be faltering. But as a long-time analyst of Ukrainian politics and society, Olga is the best possible person to give insight into how the country's coping and what the future is likely to hold. So we're incredibly lucky to have you both here. They're each going to speak for 5-10 minutes, and then for 40 minutes I get the privilege of asking them questions, which will leave us about 20 minutes for a Q&A. And after that, there's book signing next door. So, Tim, would you like to begin?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, particularly on the evening when negotiations opened between the EU and Ukraine. Round of applause. Also, which means that they batted aside Viktor Orban, which deserves another round of applause. It's great to be here with Olga and Anna, two people who've written marvelous books on Ukraine, because Anna was too modest to mention her own book, Borderland, which I like very much indeed, and which is available here. My book, I'm not an expert on Ukraine in the way that both of them are. My book is, as its subtitle suggests, a personal history of Europe. It took me just 50 years to write. 50 years of traveling around Europe, observing great events, meeting all these people, but also the so-called ordinary people who are often much more extraordinary than our politicians, which may not be saying a lot. And it's history illustrated by memoir and reportage. So the stories are there to illustrate the history. I just tell one quick story, which I apologize one or two of you will have heard before, but it's very relevant to our subject this evening. 1994, St. Petersburg, a big Western Russian meeting, all very friendly, very constructive, until a rather nasty-looking little man with a rather vaguely rat-like face, apparently some kind of sidekick of the mayor of St. Petersburg, suddenly pipes up and spoils the atmosphere by saying that there are territories that historically always belonged to Russia, and the Russian Federation has a duty to protect them, and he explicitly mentions Crimea. And he says there are 25 million Russians outside Russia, and we have to look after them. His name, of course, was Vladimir Putin. 1994, just 3 years after the end of the Soviet Union. Don't tell me the eastward enlargement of NATO was the cause of Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, the leitmotifs of the book are Europe and freedom, the two kind of leitmotifs of my life's work. When I started traveling to Europe as a very young man in the early 1970s, most Europeans were still living under dictatorships, not only the whole of Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe, but also Spain, Portugal, and Greece. For the next 35 years, you have a magnificent, though not continuous, spread of freedom across the continent, spread of the EU, spread of NATO. And then it starts turning, and that all comes under question, under threat. Ukraine features in the book at three particular points. Number one, the Orange Revolution, 2004-5, which I was lucky enough to witness at first hand, standing on the Maidan. I've never been so cold in my life. My goodness, it was cold. You remember the tent city? And I've never forgotten seeing a sea of European flags across the Maidan. I mean, the Ukraine story with the European Union, obviously, in a sense, it starts before that, but this is the first big moment, people forget. Second moment, 2014-15, seizure of Crimea, 20 years after Putin said he was interested in getting it back, and the beginning of the war in eastern Ukraine. In my book, both literally and metaphorically, this is the moment, the turning point at which the West fails to turn. I would argue that if we'd had a much stronger reaction, then we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in now. And the third moment is, of course, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February last year and what follows it. I identify what I call the post-wall era. So we're all familiar with the post-war era, post-1945. The post-wall era, which starts with the fall of the Berlin Wall, 9th of November 1989. Its first half, very optimistic, a period of great progress, and then from 2008 on, increasingly engulfing crises. And I argue that the full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February is the end of the post-war era, and that we're now in a new era. And I would say in this new era, it's not hyperbole to say that the future of Europe depends on what happens in Ukraine, but also the future of Ukraine depends on Europe. So the future of Europe depends on Ukraine in this sense. If we can help Ukraine to something that can plausibly be called victory, so that it's an independent sovereign country controlling most, if not all, of its sovereign territory, and becomes a member of the EU and NATO, we will have, for the first time ever in European history, a genuinely post-imperial Europe, right? That's to say, a Europe which has no empires either on land or overseas. That would be a great first. Europe will be larger, it will be stronger, Russia will be weaker, and the rest of the world will have seen that Europe and the West has prevailed along with Ukraine. So you talked about being data-based. My Oxford research project did a big piece of opinion polling worldwide with ECFR, European Council on Foreign Relations. Most countries outside Europe think the US is at war with Russia in Ukraine, right? They think the US is at war with Russia, and they think the credibility of Europe is at stake. So one question was, who do you think is likely to win? A lot of people say Russia's likely to win. Another question was, do you think the EU is likely to fall apart within the next 20 years? Quite a lot of people think it is. 57% in China, for example. More than 50% in Saudi Arabia and South Africa. There's a strong correlation between these two results. Russia likely to win, EU likely to fall apart. So the credibility of both the US and Europe is at stake in Ukraine. So if we don't succeed in helping Ukraine to win, and let's be clear, if Russia remains in control of the territories it currently controls, nearly 1/5 of the country, 17.8% of the territory to be precise, that will be a defeat. And that Putin will be able to claim that as a victory, and in the eyes of the rest of the world, it will be a defeat for Europe and the West. So that's why, we'll obviously talk about this more in the conversation, what happens in Ukraine is determinant for the future of Europe. Why is Europe crucial for the future of Ukraine? Because US support for Ukraine, which has been absolutely crucial in the war so far, and in its economy, is now very seriously under threat. In public opinion polling, it's going down, 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 down. In the politics, the Republican Speaker of the House was ejected in an unprecedented fashion, partly because he tried to work with the Democrats to get the funding for Ukraine. Now the funding is being held up again, despite Biden making a passionate personal appeal to Congress, making the case on grounds of US national security. So it's looking very, very dodgy. And there's a prospect of President Trump 2.0. And Trump could and probably would just pull the rug out from under Ukraine. So we can no longer rely on that scale of US support. Therefore, the challenge to Europe at the moment is not just will we continue to do as much as we've done already, which is a lot, and I think will on the whole continue, we'll talk about that, but the challenge is, will we actually do more to enable Ukraine to make a military breakthrough in a different way in the course of the next year? So that's why so much is at stake here for Ukraine, but also for Europe.
Great. So I wasn't going to start off with this, but because you ended off your remarks on the future of Europe and Ukraine's place in the future of Europe, I wanted to mention some remarks I made at a keynote a few weeks back, and it was entitled Fighting for Europe, Ukrainians' Vision of the European Union and Their Place in It. And this idea, we listened and we watched Ukrainians repeatedly, whether it be it on the Maidan as they were being shot at, or on the front lines as they're being shot at, or in their homes as bombs are falling, that they are fighting, and dying for Europe, for a future in the EU. This is literally the language that ordinary citizens have been telling us. So many of us might wonder, certainly political scientists would wonder, what drives such a fateful declaration by ordinary citizens that they are willing to die for a future in the EU, for a future in Europe. And in this project that you mentioned, we were covering data over the course of many years. Starting about 2019, we were seeing a very important shift in Ukraine. Ukrainians increasingly, not after 2014 in fact, there was a bump, but it wasn't as high. After 2019, you see a much larger bump in support for EU accession. And we're talking 20 percentage points bump. Simultaneously, we see a very important shift in public opinion. Support for democracy goes up dramatically. Right before Zelensky's election in 2019, support for democracy in the country is at 40%. Just about 30 years of independence and democracy, and 40% of the Ukrainian population thought that democracy was the best system for the country. In the midst of continued war, economic crisis, pandemic, the period between 2019 and February 16th, on the eve of all-out invasion, it goes from 40% to 60% of the population. What are the two things driving these things? Civic duty, above all, attachment to the state, a strong sense of civic identity, a strong sense of attachment to the держава, to the Ukrainian state, statehood. For support for EU, it's support for democracy, democratic values. So the EU is getting it all wrong. It's not about the economy. It's not socioeconomic future betterment. It's about liberal democratic values that are supposed to be, in fact, at the core of the EU. And what is this other weird thing that is driving this sentiment? Support for democracy increasing, and support for EU. I start finding this really weird thing in 2019. It's people who voted for Zelensky, that previously didn't hold these positions, come to hold these positions in this 3-year period. Specifically, these are people living in the southeast of the country. These are people who are ethnically Russian, who are Russophones. 30 years of independent Ukrainian politics, they did not see themselves as part of this civic community. They did not see the Ukrainian future as one that would be served by a democratic system. Something about how he spoke to them, how he conveyed their place in that future, turned them into Democrats. I can go into the very complicated statistical models that we go into to figure this out, but it starts really blowing my mind. And I start talking in weird academic circles in 2019 about something called the Zelensky effect. That was the one side of the coin, the Zelensky effect. The very real effect that Zelensky had on the key constituency. The constituency that in fact becomes literally the front line, and everyone in this room fully understands we're not being facetious by saying so. The front line with bare hands trying to stop tanks. These people who did not see themselves part of a European future, of a Ukraine that is democratic, did over time in this 3-year period, and they were in fact the ones that were immediately dealing with the all-out invasion, and of course the whole country is. One side of the coin. But there's that important other element to the Zelensky effect. It's what is the process that makes Zelensky the man who we see today? Because he is a product of a history of civic nationhood. He is not a person who rallies first. He, in fact, is not engaged in politics in the way some others of his own independence generation are. He's a late riser, perhaps, at least publicly. But he is very much nurtured in this history of civic identity, of people power in independent Ukraine, of the import of democratic politics. And how do we know this? We know this because he tells us, and he's been telling us this for decades. Henry and I did a deep dive into the content and discourse, analyzing all of his, well, the show, first of all, and we had to watch it multiple times, theatrical performances, a lot of the humor that I never liked and my family didn't like. We come from the 25 percenters. The songs that I really, really, really didn't like in some cases, that I had to pause many times and write down notes about. But then all of his campaign material for the presidential election, and then all of his speeches as president up until the writing of the book. So this goes into just about August 2022. And it's a very detailed content. And he's been talking about this all along. He's not been talking about this from February 24th. He hasn't been talking about the import of citizens' duty to engage in politics from 2019. He's actually been talking about this throughout his comedy, throughout his theatrical work, along with some other things. Through the medium of political satire, he was communicating a certain civic duty boundness and the import of ordinary citizens to engage in their democracy repeatedly. And it's not populism. This is where people who don't study political science get it wrong. Populism tends to say, they, the elites, are at fault, the corruption, the bad, everything, it's them. You, the ordinary people, you are the good ones. You are not at fault. I am like you, we are against them, broadly speaking. What he does in his theatrical work, in the show, in his speeches, in his inauguration speech, he puts the emphasis on the role of the citizen. If you are not paying your taxes, you're just as much part of the problem of corruption as someone else is. If you're paying the bribe, same thing. If you're not voting, if you're not engaging, if you do not protest when the need is there, then you are part of the problem. And you don't have to believe me. You can go and read all the speeches yourselves, and you will find this. And it's remarkable. And in fact, that when we do focus groups with ordinary people, they tell us this is what connected, that I could actually change something about my situation. Who are the people who move? And this is the thing in the book that always strikes me. And there's a few things, obviously, because I am Ukrainian, it always gets me emotional. But who are the people who move? Some of the people who had a preference for a strong leader, they moved to democracy. But they moved to democracy up until that February 16th, 2022, that data point, right? So right before the all-out invasion. Those who found it hard to say, after nearly 30 years of democratic independence, found it hard to say whether or not a democratic system was a good one for their country. They moved 2019 to February 2022. Who moves after the war, all-out war begins, after the all-out invasion begins? It's the people who up until that point reported to us in surveys that for them, it doesn't matter what system they live in. For people like me, it doesn't matter. The war crystallized for them that it in fact does. But the people who found it hard to say or that were autocrats are the people that were brought along with Zelensky for the journey. So two sides of the same coin. He is not a hero, simply. He is a complex character. We talk about a lot of the things that you can critique about Zelensky in the book. And there are many. I'm waiting for the investigative study of his time at Inter, when he was general producer of Inter. General producer of Inter network, not channel. This is the equivalent of being general producer of Sky, the whole package, or Fox network. These are incredibly powerful people. He was a political elite insider. He was asked and approached by Poroshenko's team twice to be on the party list and in the top 5 spots, including in 2018. This was a political insider. There's probably a lot more things that need to be investigated about those earlier years. But nonetheless, it was a person that was able to embody a civic identity, a civic duty, and able then to convince others to go along with the ride. Because you mentioned a story, I will mention one too. Zelensky picks fascinating individuals to carry the message across. We cite Lina Kostenko as one of the messages that he was trying to get across for people who were working with the Russians. And he used her poem, Ne treba думати мізерно, no need to think meagerly, to get the point across. The story from his team is that he just knew it off by heart because apparently he's really into history and literature and he's this erudite kid. So they say. But he also uses a lot of other dissidents in his speeches. And if you recall those nights right before all-out invasion, when we knew already what was happening, just after Putin's first half of the speech, he tells us of Ivan Dzuba's death. Ivan Dzuba is an incredibly important, incredibly famous Ukrainian dissident. Most people know him as a dissident that's a nationalist, right? That is this fervent Ukrainian nationalist. But Ivan Dzuba's story is more interesting than that. And Zelensky uses him exactly for this purpose, to communicate to the following constituency. Ivan Dzuba is from Donetsk Oblast. He grows up speaking Russian. He learns Ukrainian only in his 20s. And then he writes one of the most famous treaties on Russian chauvinism and imperialism in Ukraine. And he so fervently believes that you can change the communist system at the time, that what does he do? Does anyone know? He hand delivers to the Communist Party headquarters this treatise. Did you know that? Hand delivers this treatise. Of course, the story ends very poorly for Ivan Dzuba. There's a young student a little bit later down the line that's reproducing this treatise at his university and handing out. He's a famous poet. His name is Holoborodko. Zelensky swears he didn't choose that name for that reason. Holoborodko hates Zelensky and says he has nothing to do with this. These are these little stories of real Ukrainians from the east of Ukraine who are incredibly important for the civic nationhood of Ukraine. And he uses these characters to rally people around the flag. And that's what the book is about.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating. I thought we'd start looking at Ukraine and where it's at now, how it's dealing with the strains and stresses of the war now, nearly 2 years in. And I thought I'd start with you, Olga, since you follow, Ukrainian public opinion in enormous detail. What are the strengths? What are the strains? What things make you hopeful? What things make you worry?
The Ukrainian people make me hopeful. This is, and I don't say this to be flippant. We do these, social scientists, we do these surveys, we collect all this data, we run our models. In surveys, we have multiple choice questions. How did you engage? How are you currently engaging in the war effort? And there's multiple choice answers that we come up with, right? We always leave the option for other. Rarely do we get anything other in there. Now we get hundreds of responses, and people want to record their engagement in the war as follows. I milked the goatlings because their protein is better than the other milk that you can get, and I walked it over to the soldiers. I dug up potatoes. I made a hearty Ukrainian soup. And these are the real ordinary life stories of ordinary Ukrainians. And they are doing this, they are engaged in the war effort, and they want it recorded, and they're reporting to us that they are consistently engaged. That gives me incredible hope. What worries me, obviously, the not having air cover, not receiving certain types of weaponry. ATACMS are going to make a big difference, but nonetheless, what worries me also is the potential for Ukrainian elite to fall prey to their own power gains and start dividing the country again. And that, even if it's 25 versus 75%, you really don't need that to happen, and you certainly don't want that to happen in the wartime.
I mean, my latest trip, I sort of sense, and my experience, this is all purely anecdotal, not sort of polling driven like what you're looking at. But there are sort of, we like to think of Ukraine as unified, everybody brought together by this new war. And in many senses, of course, that's true, but you've also got these inevitable wartime divides beginning to widen. I mean, any country in war, same thing. So between people who are fighting, people who aren't, people who are still in the country, people who aren't, between the rear and the front, there's a sort of dramatic difference between Lviv, where the old town is chock-a-block with young people having fun outside all the bars. I mean, some of them are sort of soldiers on leave, but not all. And the frontline towns and cities which are being shelled constantly, and life is absolutely miserable. I mean, and at the same time we've got the normal politics is beginning to sort of resume a bit more. You've got Klitschko, criticising Zelensky for taking too many powers into the middle presidential administration. You've got, Zaluzhny, talking about, confessing to a stalemate, being slapped down by Zelensky. It's all, that sort of heroic period of the war, when everybody was absolutely fully committed, running on adrenaline, no disagreements, the motto was, everybody does what they can. That, I feel, is over. I mean, do you get that sense, or is that me?
You were just there, so
yeah, well, yeah,
you
Tim,
start and I'll follow.
Yes and no. I don't think politics ever disappeared. So I think these tensions were there all along, and Klitschko made more than one comment throughout the war. Poroshenko certainly has done the same, and Zelensky's team have repeatedly entered into various conflicts with these opposition groups. This is not something that wasn't happening throughout the last nearly now, unfortunately, 2 years. Tensions among ordinary citizens and the identifying of groups that are perhaps paying the cost of war more. That certainly is coming out in our data as well, and we can go into that in more detail. I'm not going to talk about my friends and family because I don't do that ever publicly. But what I think is most worrying about all of this is that what you described, the potential visions of different costs, the messiness of political communication that is happening right now. It is happening at a time when about 60% of the population is considered to have PTSD. We're trying to get at that actually now with a series of different studies, but this is what the Ukrainian Psychiatric Association estimates. And when people are experiencing this kind of trauma and complex PTSD, they are much more likely to react affectively to fights between politicians. Mm-hmm. They are much more likely to react affectively to, I'm paying the greater cost and somebody gets to party in Lviv. And all sorts of other things can happen in that kind of population, and that is extremely dangerous for Ukraine. Mm-hmm.
Let me follow directly on that. I'm not an expert on Ukrainian politics as Olga is, but I've been to Ukraine 4 times since the beginning of the full-scale war, the last time in October. One has to start by saying what Olga said, that the sense of courage, patriotism, mobilization, engagement was extraordinary. I mean, just amazing. Literally the first thing I saw on my first visit to Ukraine after the beginning of the full-scale war was volunteers making candles for the troops in the trenches, and it goes on from there. Everybody doing something, and almost a year ago to the day, I met a guy called Yevgen Hulevich, who was a critic translator in Lviv, early 40s, volunteered to defend his country after the 24th of February, wounded, came back to Lviv, got better, went back to the front, months of hard fighting for Kherson, badly wounded again, came out, and when I met him, he was just preparing to go back. And he said, my comrades will need me. They need an experienced soldier, and he was killed in the terrible fighting near Bakhmut on the last day of last year. So that was, what an extraordinary individual and what a fate. But in each successive visit, I have found people more exhausted, visibly exhausted. People have aged years in the 6 months between seeing them, including government ministers, by the way. Olga Stefanishina, the last time I saw her, just looked just completely exhausted and frustrated. A frustration directed quite a lot against the West. Why didn't you do more to help us? But also, as you say, beginning to be against each other, so the politics are back. And, if you're a democracy, at some point you've got to have an election. Andrew Wilson, who's here, has just written a very good paper on this for ECFR. But to have an election means divisions and arguments. And so I think everybody agrees this is not the time, but how long can you go on before actually, if you are defending democracy, having an election? So already you hear the politics coming back, and not to mention the tensions between Zelensky and Zelensky and Klitschko and the Poroshenko crowd and so on. But there's, for me, an almost even bigger concern. Every time I go, I have a student to help me. Wherever I am. So I made a lot of students, and they're fantastic. I mean, in addition to what you call the independence generation, I would say there are the 22ers, the generation of very young people who are absolutely shaped for life by the experience of this war. And they're fantastic because, they have kind of good education, they have experience of Europe, but they also have this extraordinary patriotic spirit. And for me, the word of the year, volia, with freedom and the will to fight for freedom. But you then say to them, so, how about your friends? And they say, 90% of my friends are outside the country, somewhere in the West. So Ukraine has a history of depopulation, of declining population, roughly speaking, since independence. And then, of course, with the war, 6-7 million people outside. And the danger is, I think this is a huge danger for the country, that if the war goes on for another year, or God forbid, 2, instead of the wives and children coming back from Germany or France or Britain to rejoin the husbands will go to join the wives and children. And that's going to be just an immense challenge, because how you reconstruct the country and bring it back to Europe if you don't have enough people, and precisely the most energetic and best qualified people.
I got that as well. I mean, it was a repeated theme. People said this fear of permanent brain drain and permanent depopulation.
Can I just jump in on that? Because there's a few things that we already know actually about the Ukrainian population based on things we've been studying for a few years. People actually who have a strong sense of attachment to the state and then continue with that strong sense of attachment to the state, they are very highly likely to return. And so there are several studies that are trying to capture the opinions, preferences, and engagements of Ukrainians abroad. And there's a very large population that has sustained with this particular state attachment. And they are the people that are also frequently coming back. And they're not really fully permanently here. And they actually report not feeling permanence here. And then there's a different group that looks very different. And to track these groups, and if one group is growing over the other, is really important. The second thing I think that's important about the depopulation in Ukraine, it's an ongoing theme in Ukraine. And actually, we were surprised by how much of the pre-all-out war speeches and political satire of Zelensky's was actually preoccupied very specifically with those who left the country and saying that it is your duty to return. And so it will be interesting if that's something that he keeps then bringing back actually in more of his public speeches, or if the political opposition also is able to use this particular issue as maybe their issue in any further elections. The opposition currently doesn't have a policy space that's their own, and one that centers around civicness and return could actually be very powerful both at home and abroad.
Although I have to say, if you look at what's happened to Bulgaria, to Lithuania, even in the case of Poland, you know, the collective ethos is about patriotism and return, but the individual decisions are very often to stay outside the country. And you know, who are we to argue with a young mother with 2 children where, you know, you have a decent job in Germany, the schools are better, the hospitals are better, and so on. So I think, Olga, there's a kind of tipping point. That's the danger. At one side of the tipping point, if the country has victory, I think that's going to be really important psychologically for people coming back. And there's a real prospect of reconstruction, and there are actually jobs there, and there are schools, by the way, because the schools are badly affected. Then I think you could have a large movement back. But if it just goes the other side of the tipping point, then you could have an aggregation of millions of individual decisions that will be, we're going to stay outside. Given, by the way, that you know, Western Europe needs a lot of people to pay our pensions.
I thought we perhaps ought to move on to the EU now and Ukraine within the EU, where we had this fantastic news today. But I'd like to ask you both, you know, the big question, will Ukraine really, in the end, be admitted to the European Union? You know, what are the factors at play? What's going to determine that? And what's the time scale? I thought I'd start with you, Tim.
So, one of the many amazing things have happened since the 24th of February 2022, but one of the most amazing is that France has decided in favour of enlarging the EU. Traditionally, France has always been against enlarging the EU because obviously that means the centre would move towards the east, and clearly the centre of Europe should be Paris. That's self-evident. This year, Emmanuel Macron changed that quite dramatically and suddenly has become an advocate of EU enlargement and indeed NATO enlargement to Ukraine. And a friend of mine says that we British have the royal family, but France has the monarchy. And that's true. And so the advantage of being a Republican monarchy is when the monarch changes his mind, then the whole policy of the state changes. So that there's a really significant shift in the politics of the EU. Germany is in favour. Countries like Spain and Portugal are reluctant, Italy are reluctant. So, but I think there's a, you know, there is a kind of geopolitical strategic understanding that's important for the future of the EU. The problem comes when Ukrainian grain starts competing with Polish grain, or Ukrainian track drivers with Polish track drivers, let alone when farm subsidies have to go from French farmers to Ukrainian farmers. So the answer to your question, Anna, is it's going to work, it's going to happen, if we can create a virtuous cycle between reconstruction and reform inside Ukraine and incremental steps of getting closer to the EU, such that you in Ukraine do this, you get that. You get that, you do this. And so you create this kind of positive feedback loop. Telecommunications sector, infrastructure funds, climate change, parts of the single market, maybe eventually even the whole single market. And the other advantage of that is you leave the really difficult things like the CAP, taking money from French farmers to give it to Ukrainian farmers, structural funds, the actual decision-making structures of the EU to further down the road. So I think it can happen, but only if it's done in a very different way from how the previous enlargements were done. And if you get the reform and reconstruction in Ukraine that is then rewarded with more access, and so you get this virtuous circle.
Do you think the EU is capable of making the internal reforms that will make it work?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I mean, look, this is unprecedented in European history. Already to have a union of 27, a non-hegemonic union of 27 member states, stretching so far across the continent, that's already unprecedented. So it's already a miracle. But the leap from 27 to 35 is actually much smaller than the leap from, say, 6 to 15 or 20. So I think there's no reason in principle why we shouldn't make those changes. Of course, it's going to be very difficult to abolish unanimity by unanimity, which is what you have to do to get to qualified majority voting, which is why I think you need time for those processes.
And you're not worried about, the sort of Wilders in the Netherlands, Orban, Fico, Alternative for Germany, etc., etc.
I'm always worried about Viktor Orban. I've been worried about Viktor Orban for 17 years.
But what are the chances, do you think, this sort of narrow, blinkered nationalist, populism will bring this process
obviously
forward?
It depends which way the whole EU goes in its politics. Because if you get more Orbans, by the way, Fico, I was just in Slovakia 2 weeks ago. Fico is what we call a pragmatist. He's pragmatic in the Russian sense of the word. So he's actually, although he said I wouldn't send a single bullet to Ukraine, he is still allowing the Western arms deliverers to go through Slovakia, and he wasn't going to oppose the opening of negotiations. It was only Orban. So obviously it matters how the larger politics inside the EU go. For me, the key to this is Germany. Germany is the central power of the European Union. It's by far the most powerful country. If Germany became really committed to pushing the agenda of enlargement, including Ukraine, that would make a very big difference to the chances of it happening. So I'm not saying it will, but I think it is entirely possible that it could, in a time frame of 5 to 10 years.
Would you like to talk about this, Olga?
I think, I'm not sure the incremental approach is the way to go. I think Ukraine needs the Polish approach, which is, it is too important, too big, and Ukraine symbolically entering into the EU means too much for the EU not to do it. If we did an incremental approach with Poland, it would have never had the amount of reforms, economic, political, or social necessary. And I'm saying this as a citizen of Poland, as a child of Polish diplomats who are very much involved in some of these processes. So often a lot of this is about political will and the right, and in the countries that you mentioned particularly, being ready to do this. Also, I think it's very, very important not to fall prey to this. Ukraine's biggest issue right now is corruption, and without solving this big corruption, you cannot enter the EU, for instance. We're not even talking about the markets and the grain, and which is going to be, the agricultural market reforms are going to be immense, right? That's going to be a major negotiation point and stalling point for sure. But when it comes to, let's not pretend that Ukraine actually hasn't made huge strides in tackling corruption. Perceptions of corruption are still highly negative, but those perceptions of corruption tend to be by people that are outside of Ukraine reporting in various surveys their perceptions of corruption. Unfortunately, this is where we are. And a lot of people, including Transparency International, including folks in Freedom House, we've had this conversation with folks in Freedom House, maybe they are slightly behind in the measure of these things. Maybe Ukraine did a little bit more already. And acknowledging its accomplishments is really important, not least because war is exactly the sort of environment where corruption will occur. It is the environment where corruption will not only occur, but it can breed all sorts of corruption. So if we're saying that certain things will have to be changed and will have to be done incrementally, then we're looking at a 50, 60 year timeline for Ukraine, and there's always something that you can say no to Ukraine about. So political will be so much more important than actually achieving these little things, tick boxes, whether they are there or not. Because Romania would have been never let in.
Yes.
And Bulgaria would have been never let in. And Poland was nowhere near achieving everything that it should have. And Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had problems when it comes to their ethnic minorities and rights. So when there's a will, there's a way. And I very much hope that the players that you're talking about will continue with the will.
Tim looks as though he'd like to reply to that.
I would love to be with you on that, but hope on. There's not a snowball's chance in hell of that happening, point number one. Point number two, it took 15 years for Poland to come in. Let me remind you, Poland, 1st of May 2004, right? 4th June 1989, 1st of May 2004, 15 years. And that was in a very favorable environment. What I am suggesting actually offers Ukraine more sooner than the idea of the Big Bang, which is not going to happen. Now, where I agree with you is that that people keep going on as if Ukraine is uniquely corrupt. And actually, you're right, in many areas, Ukraine has done more significant reform than many of the Western Balkan candidate countries. And that is absolutely true. So that in those areas where those significant reforms have been made, then you should be looking for these elements of partial membership of the EU. But I'm afraid, if you want to advocate for the immediate Big Bang, you're just not going to get anywhere. So I think this is actually a better deal for Ukraine and a faster one.
I thought my last question on inevitably, and one hates to always talk about Ukraine and in sort of in terms of other countries, but Russia. We're very bad at predicting events in Russia. So the Prigozhin rebellion, for example, came as a surprise to everybody. And our information is getting progressively worse and worse as journalists leave the country and Russians become afraid to speak to foreigners. When I was reading your book, Tim, one of the things that boosted me about it was the reminder that the collapse of the Soviet bloc in the end of the 80s was completely unexpected at the time. Nobody predicted it, nobody saw it coming. The Czechs and the Poles and the Slovaks and so on didn't see it coming either. One hopes that similarly there are things going on under the surface in Russia which we're not aware of. Do you see, is this wishful thinking, or do you two see sort of straws in the wind, things which aren't being talked about, being overlooked, which could lead us to hope that Putin's days are numbered?
Well, one of the frustrating things about a lot of discussions about Ukraine is that they end up being about Russia. Sometimes 90% about Russia. But what I think is true is that the Prigozhin affair showed us that in a regime like that, you can have non-linear developments, right? Much more so than in a democracy where there's much more transparency, much more visibility, much more understanding of what's going on. And that's why, I don't think we should put all our hopes in it, but that's why we really need to stick the course and to keep with Ukraine and to find a way to help the Ukrainian armed forces to secure a very significant victory, right? Because remember, this time last year, Putin didn't do his big conference and direct line thing. Why? Because Ukraine had just been scoring very significant victories in the Kharkiv offensive and beyond, and he was feeling very insecure. So it's very bad news that he's just done it today. I watched it for my sins for hours on end. And so for me, the most immediate question is not about how we do EU membership or NATO membership or anything of that. It's, given it's so difficult to make progress on the ground militarily, and one of the things I did in Lviv just in October was to visit the rehabilitation clinic near Zlomny, which is incredibly moving because you have these soldiers without one leg, without two legs, without one arm, without two arms, without a hand, without a foot, all because of those absolutely terrible Russian minefields. I mean, huge Russian minefields. And they were telling me just how difficult it is to make the progress on land against those minefields and then 3 lines of Russian defense. So the question is, can we, and when I say we, I mean the West as a whole, find asymmetric means of fighting the next phase of the war? For example, going after the supply lines to Crimea, which we haven't seriously tried, really squeezing Crimea, which is potentially vulnerable, such that everyone can see that Ukraine has got another big victory and Russia a defeat. And if there's to be a chance of that kind of non-linear development in Russia, I think it's, it follows on a visible defeat. Ideally before March, the presidential election in Russia.
Olga?
Yeah, and I think the delivery of ATACMS is going to be quite particularly important in that, and that's the ability to go a certain hit behind enemy lines, right? And that's, with air cover, it would be even better, because when you're demining, the air cover is providing you literally cover to demine in order to do this, plus the ATACMS, but we'll see what happens. I spoke to some military folks in DC. They were explaining it to me. There apparently is a plan in place. We'll see if it happens. But I think beyond this, I'm always haunted by Timur Kuran's words on, out of never you have revolution. And that has happened repeatedly in Russian history. In fact, one of the things that we were discussing just a few weeks ago with Sam Green from King's, we were talking about different styles of leadership in Ukraine and in Russia. And then the story that seemed to come out of our conversation was that Russians are followers in a very particular way, and they're being managed by the big boss and so on, who's really giving them all sorts of little bits and pieces in his speeches, but never trying to actually actively mobilize them. Certainly not trying to rally up civic identity and engagement. And then everyone, oh yes, because the Russians won't rebel. And then I thought, well, maybe it's precisely because it's too dangerous to rally up the Russians. What if the Russians actually do have it in them? And what if out of never we have a revolution? It has happened more than once. And I think anyone studying the late Soviet period, and there are many people around, when you read those articles that are coming out in the late 80s that absolutely do not predict the end of the Soviet Empire, and then yet it does happen, they are remarkable to read. So I think actually Andrew Wilson could tell us a little bit more about the politechnologists in Russia and where the weak spots are, but maybe that's for a different time.
Well, I think it is time to move on to the Q&A, so perhaps Andrew, you would like to just say a bit.
I put you on the spot. You don't have to, absolutely.
What about political technologies in Russia? Everything is hyper-managed. So they have spent so many years destroying political agency, subjectivity, including the people who normally support them. They also have to be demobilised and disorganised. But in political science terms, in terms of traditional collective action models, it's extremely unlikely. Russia is such a controlled society, including in the head, obviously. I like your phrase, Tim, about non-linear events. You know, they can have a huge impact. In fact, the Ukrainians looked at the map of Prigozhin driving up the motorway towards Moscow and thought, we could do that if the West allowed us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, by the way, I had a very interesting conversation with Mr. Budanov, as you know, the head of Ukrainian military intelligence. His argument was essentially what Russia really cares about is Crimea. So if you're trying to have a political psychological effect as well as a military one, you've got to go for Crimea, and that makes sense for me actually, both militarily, but also in terms of the political psychological effect on Russia.
And you have a lot of Ukrainians saying Crimea is easier than the Donbass. Yes. Yeah? In terms of scaring the Russians away by making it inhospitable.
Well, the supply line's extremely vulnerable.
Yeah.
But of course, Crimea is also the least, it was the only oblast in Ukraine which, it only just voted for independence back in 1991. It's the most pro-Russian oblast. One has to recognise that. So there's a paradox there.
I think it's very important not to confuse wanting to have close ties with Russia and wanting to have protection of the Russian language with wanting to be ruled by Russia. And actually the data doesn't quite really nicely show that even in Crimea people wanted to be ruled by Russia. They envisaged a version of a Russian Crimea within the state of Ukraine. So it's a little bit more complicated even there, but I agree.
It is.
The supply lines are vulnerable, and that's the way to go. So we can do that tomorrow.
We ought to get on
Yes.
to the Q&A. I thought I'd take them in twos, perhaps, and please keep it sort of short questions rather than statements. The gentleman's back.
So I was going to ask about the impact of Maidan. Are we still not putting Maidan into a deep historical context in terms of European revolutions? And what is the other perception of Maidan on, say, Putin's side? Is he deeply fearful of Maidan, say the Maidan effect, even though he might see it as a colour revolution as opposed to an organic kind of process?
And William.
So as we know from Zelensky's TV shows, the strings in Ukrainian politics are pulled by oligarchs, including his strings, of course, in the beginning. Yeah?
No.
Well, it's an interesting relationship with Mr. Konovaisky. Yeah?
Well, no, but we can talk about it more.
Yeah. So, obviously the role of the oligarchs has been profoundly challenged by the war, both the financial impact of the war, also by the reforms. But some of them are still around. We see some of them popping up in London occasionally doing various interesting things. Not that long ago. So my question to you is, how do you see the role of the oligarchs in Ukrainian politics going forward? And also, it relates to this very important question.
Who'd like to tackle those first?
Do you want to take the oligarch? And I'll take the revolution.
Okay.
I think I want to take the revolutions.
Go on.
Let's do a little bit of both. You go first. Go ahead.
Okay. So obviously I've spent quite a lot of my working life thinking about revolutions in Central and Eastern Europe. And a Russian journalist called Konstantin von Eggert said the most important thing that happened in Russian politics in the last 20 years happened outside Russia. And it was the Orange Revolution. Because it was the Orange Revolution that first made Putin think that what he thinks of as Western manipulated color revolutions are coming onto my front lawn. And then, of course, you're Euromaidan even more. So that, as a friend of mine says, his fear was not NATO enlargement, it was democracy enlargement. So I think it plays an absolutely crucial role in his reaction to what's happening in Ukraine. On the oligarchs, I'll leave Olga to say more, but just one comment which I heard was when I was last in Kiev in July. We talked to several anti-corruption activists, NGO, not just public, but NGO. And they said the danger is not so much the old oligarchs. The danger is new oligarchs. Oligarchs who are created by the dominance of the Zelensky administration, of people like Andrei Yermak, whose hands are not of the cleanest, let's put it gently, using all the kind of vast funds that are going to be involved in reconstruction. So I think it's the new oligarchs we need to look out for more than the old ones.
I think the old oligarchs are still a problem, but they are far less powerful than they used to be, and they have decided to rally around the state. They have done very important work, and there's several laws that I think are doing with some of their monopolies, dealing with their monopolies. And I don't disagree that war creates the opportunities for enrichment and for corruption. It's not simply in this case, that's in cases globally. And that is going to be something that needs to be monitored and obviously dealt with. And anyone that's looking at this administration will be looking exactly at this and exactly whether or not there's the continued cleaning of house when necessary or not. When that ceases, we will be even more aware. There has been multiple waves of cleaning of house that have been unexpected, that have been surprising, and that have been rather smooth. The Ministry of Defense procurement scandals is one. When it became unsustainable for the minister to stay in power in that, not that he was involved, but that there was this happening. This was dealt with. He was involved with finding his successor. It's a very important story. It's a very impressive story, actually. Oligarchs, they continue to exist, including one is the leader of a political party in parliament. And that continues to be a problem when you're looking at the quality of liberal democracy in any country. If a person who became a billionaire by virtue of being involved in every single administration throughout the nearly 30 years, and they continue to be the major player in the opposition, that is a question, right? And that goes on Zelensky's side, that goes on Poroshenko's side, and there's obviously Yulia Tymoshenko and others. And this is something that people will have to deal with. I am looking for the next leader in European solidarity. I am looking for who will be replacing Poroshenko in the leadership role there. And if that is managed well, we'll start being able to truly talk about the de-oligarchization of Ukraine in its political realm. And until then, I think we have multiple fronts to be looking at, and that's very serious. And unfortunately, multiple fronts in power and opposing power. When it comes to Kolomoisky, actually, so I don't know how much you know the story about fighting for Zelensky and recruiting him as a general producer. So, you know, he was at Odin plus Odin, Rodnyansky et al. They were fighting with Kolomoisky to recruit him. There was this massive, he was young, and this massive bidding war for him. It's a really interesting story to investigate. And of course, he goes back and forth to Odin plus Odin later when Kolomoisky takes over. He knew all of them. He met with all of them. This is why that story, I think, still needs to be told, and will be much more interesting than many people think. When it comes to the actual election, they used each other. He was certainly not a puppet of Kolomoisky's, and it is not quite clear whether there was a power balance that tipped one way or the other. They were partners until they weren't, and everything that happened with Kolomoisky thereafter, we know that he couldn't have been simply a puppeteer. And we spoke to people off the record on various sides of this equation, and they all confirmed this, the people who are actually insiders on both teams. And that's actually more surprising, but far more interesting. And I think that also makes Zelensky much more interesting and potentially a much more dangerous character if you're worried about one day him not being a Democrat. If that were to happen, I don't see that happening yet, to be clear, but if that were to happen, this was a person that was able to manage major players in Ukrainian politics in a very convincing way for a very long time. And that, I think, is a little bit scarier than simply being a puppet of somebody's.
Interesting answer. This gentleman has got a question.
I have a question for Garton Ash. My view as a historian is that this is the end of the Russian Empire. It was delayed for 3 generations by this perverse Soviet Union, but now it's coming to an end. That's why it's so intense. and I'm very interested by what you said about opinions of Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. I'm working with Ukrainian websites, so I get information about this. My question to Timothy Garton Ash is, in the post-war period, the justification of NATO was to keep Russia out, keep the Americans in, and keep Germany down. What would be an equivalent for the post-war period?
Thank you. And then there's a gentleman behind as well.
Yeah, my question is, we've got news today from Brussels, but how long can the European Union just keep buying out Orban? Because effectively, we have allowed Orban to destroy democracy in Hungary, which shouldn't be possible, and I just don't see how it goes anywhere. So how are we going to deal with Orban in the longer run?
Yeah, I think that for me initially, I don't know if you know a wonderful book by a German historian, Martin Schulze-Bessel, just recently appeared, called Der Flucht des Imperiums, The Curse of Empire. 300 years of Russian imperialism from Peter the Great onwards in the triangle with Ukraine and Poland. I mean, that is the context in which we have to see this. And, it's Big Brzezinski's famous line that with Ukraine, Russia will always still be an empire. Without Ukraine, Russia will no longer be an empire, is obviously an oversimplification because there are lots of other remaining bits of the Russian empire. But, it's good enough for politics. I mean, it will do. So that is undoubtedly the issue that is at stake for us and for Vladimir Putin. He makes no bones about no bones about that. And I think the case for NATO is for us Europeans to defend ourselves against, first of all, a Vladimir Putin who wouldn't necessarily stop at Ukraine, who might go on to Moldova if he's successful in Ukraine. As Anna Reid, the Finnish Prime Minister, said, NATO, that's the line Russia won't cross. That's why Sweden and Finland are joining. But also against the other major potential threats that are coming our way. So longer term, I think it's in the vital interest of Europe. The other question was Orban. Oh yes, my favorite. The problem is that while the European Union in its own constitutional theory is a union of democracies, that's what it says in Article 2 of its treaty, the values of democracy have actually been retrofitted into what is still essentially an economic community, right? So it's actually what we failed to do up till now is to make an effective linkage between the values and the money, right? Once again, literally today, we've seen that because the EU has to release 10 billion. Remember, Ukraine got only 18 billion, a country of 40 million people, at war for the whole of last year. Orban, for a country of less than 10 million people, has now got another 10 billion, right? So how do you break that? How do you make that linkage effective? We have to get much tougher in using what's called Article 7, which in principle allows you to go to the point of suspending a member state's voting rights. Now that we have Donald Tusk back in government in Poland, the only guy who might veto for Orban is Robert Fico in Slovakia, but Fico always has his price. So I would push for a much harder, but it needs some major powers of the EU, notably Germany, but also France and Italy, really to get serious about this issue, and that hasn't happened yet.
Would you like to say anything on this?
No, I think, I agree.
I think we've run out of time, so I'm just going to end with a quote from Tim's book, which I thought rather sums up the feelings of probably many of us here about Brexit. And then it goes. I felt a pang when the European flags came down on official buildings in Britain after Brexit, and we were faced instead with the spectacle of Churchill parodied Boris Johnson blustering away, flanked only by 2 Union Jacks. Something larger was lost, as important as freedom of movement or membership of the single market, an aspiration to be at once our national selves and something more than just our national selves. Now one hopes that Britain, gets back that sort of that ambition, that broadness of view, and Ukraine has it, and hopefully it's going to, it's going to happen. It will become a member of the European Union, which is, and a big step forward has been taken today, and that is absolutely fantastic news and something to celebrate. So thank you all very much for coming. And books are for sale next door. There you go.